I work at a graveyard as an assistant to the old gravekeeper, a man too aged to do the work himself anymore. We live in a small house within the cemetery, just the two of us. Well, at least that's what I thought. For some time now, I've noticed something strange. Whenever I step outside the grave house, the heavy wooden door creaks open and a young woman slips out. Before I can even process what's happening, she darts back inside. But when I rush in after her, there's no trace of anyone, just Pops, the old man, either resting or staring into space. I've tried to make sense of it, but it never adds up. How does she get inside, and where does she disappear to? Then, on a particularly windy evening, things took a turn. The door swung open again, and this time she wasn't alone. 3 small children followed closely behind her, but as she tried to retreat back inside, the door slammed shut by the wind before she could reach it. Panic flashed across her face as she turned the knob, pushing against the door, but when it opened, she froze. Her eyes widened in shock as though she didn't recognize what was inside. I seized the opportunity, grabbing her arm. "Who are you?" I demanded. "How do you keep sneaking into my house?" Something about her expression softened me. I let go of her arm, watching as she clutched her children close. After a long silence, she finally spoke. Her story. "I grew up with my father and brother. It was just the 3 of us, always isolated from the world. Our home felt like a cage, but I never questioned it until I started getting older. One day, my father gave me a small traditional gourd and warned me never to leave the house without it. I didn't understand why until I forgot it once. Our front door usually opened onto a quiet residential street. I could see a few people passing by, hear distant voices from the market. But the day I stepped outside without my gourd, the world was different. The moment I crossed the threshold, I turned around, and the door led straight to a graveyard. This graveyard. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, even though I noticed it a few more times when I opened the door without my gourd. But something similar happened again at the market where we bought food. I dropped some money and bent down to pick it up. As I looked between my legs, I saw the truth. The people around me weren't normal. They walked backward, their faces nothing but skulls. The market women cooked over pots with no visible flames. My heart pounded. When I stood upright, some of them had noticed me. One of the women, one who had always been kind to us, screamed at my father. "I have warned you. Take these children back. They are not of us. This is not good for you. Not for her, not for the boy, not for any of us." My father dropped to his knees, begging her to bear with us. It was confusing for me to see my dad, a strong man, begging a market woman, apologizing over and over. That night he spoke to me about marriage, saying I was of age. I was only 15. Before I knew it, I was married off to my father's closest friend, a man who often drank with him. But even after 3 years and 3 children, I never moved into my husband's home. He only visited me in my father's house, fulfilling his duties as a husband in private. My brother despised him, never speaking a word to him, always glaring. I didn't understand why. As I grew older, the questions piled up. Why did we have no mother, no extended family? My father never had answers. Why was our wedding held in secret? My husband always promised he'd tell me one day, and my brother, he was the most distant of all. When I finally confronted him, I asked, "Why do you hate my husband?" He didn't even look at me. "Ask the man you call your father," he said. "Tell him to explain why he is keeping us here." Our father had been in the room at the time. He only laughed and said, "Don't mind your brother. He's jealous because he refuses to marry. I even found him a wife, and he rejected her." My brother snapped, "Don't you ever talk to me about marriage. I will never marry your kind. I am not one of you, and I will never procreate with such." Our father lowered his head, ashamed. Not long after, I overheard my father talking to my husband. That evening, my husband told me he was finally taking me to meet his family. I was relieved, excited. I packed my children's things, dressed them nicely, and stepped out the door. I forgot my gourd. The door slammed shut behind me, locking me out. Her story left me unsettled. I shook my head. "That's impossible," I said. "This is just a graveyard. Only Pops and I live here." I pushed the door open to show her. Nothing had changed, just a small, empty grave house. She stared, then started opening and closing the door over and over as if expecting it to change. When it didn't, she collapsed in tears. I didn't know what else to do. "Do you have anywhere to go?" I asked. She shook her head. "I only know the description to my father's family house, which he used to tell us, the market, and the description to my husband's family home." The market she described didn't match anything I knew, but her husband's house sounded like a nearby town where I sometimes hire men to help dig graves. I decided to take her there, to her husband's house. When we arrived, a young man listened to her story, and he led us to an old woman's house, who, according to him, sounds like might be related to the man this mysterious lady speaks about. The old woman looked at the children and froze. "These children, why do they look like my son?" The young woman hesitated. "Because he is their father, my husband." The old woman's face darkened. "That's impossible. My son has been dead for 20 years. He and his friend were attacked and killed while traveling." I felt like a fool between these women, but they obviously were not joking. The old woman was certain that these kids looked like her son, and was also certain that her son passed on, even buried, 20 years ago. We left, but I needed more answers. Taking the lady and her 3 kids, we searched for her father's house, following whatever clues she could recall. Finally, we found another elderly woman in the same town, less than 3 kilometers away, one who looked eerily like the young woman. I'm telling you, same nose, same eyes, same cheeks. In fact, the only difference between this lady and the elderly woman was their age differences. This elderly woman welcomed us into her home. In her home, there were photos on the wall. The young woman pointed to one. "That's my father and husband," she whispered. The old woman's face turned grim. "Those men? My late son with best friend? Not possible, young girl. They died 20 years ago." The story spread fast. People gathered, confirming that the young woman bore a striking resemblance to the elderly woman, and that her so-called husband had been buried decades ago, his grave lying right outside. I was very, very confused. Way too much data for me to comprehend. Not just one, tens of people were rushing in, confirming she resembles the elderly woman and her kids resemble the first old woman. This repeated testimony from different people in the town began to seem credible. It shattered her. She was hospitalized for months. Psychologists and psychiatrists couldn't make meaning out of her claims. Police couldn't find any records of her, nor any of her kids. Even now, she is not fully stable. Her children, now in their teens, live under the shared custody of the 2 old women, their supposed grandmother and great-grandmother. As for the young woman, she still visits the graveyard. Sometimes I catch her opening the grave house door, peering inside, as if hoping to see someone other than reality, which is just my poor graveyard house. But the house remains the same, and she remains lost between 2 worlds. I've been driving for Uber for a while now, and I've had my fair share of weird rides. But nothing compares to what happened that night. It was around 2:30 a.m. when I got the request, a pickup at Woodlawn Cemetery. I stared at my screen for a second, debating whether to accept it. Who the hell orders an Uber from a cemetery at that hour? Still, money is money. So against my better judgment, I took the ride. When I pulled up to the cemetery gates, she was already there, standing just outside the entrance. She looked normal enough, maybe in her late 20s, dressed in plain clothes, no signs of distress, no indication that this would be the most unsettling ride of my life. She got in without a word. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "West 68th Street." I waited for more details, but all she added was 10452. No building number, just the area code. That was weird, but whatever. She had already paid through the app. I started driving, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I don't usually talk much while driving, but something about the silence felt heavy. I tried making small talk a few times. Simple things, "How's your night going? You live in the area?" But she never answered. She just sat there. I kept my eyes on the road, telling myself I was just overthinking things. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she didn't feel like talking. The closer we got to her destination, the more relieved I felt. Just a few more minutes and this whole thing would be over. Then, as I approached exit 10 on the Bronx River Parkway, I felt a tap on my shoulder. "Here's your tip," she said. I glanced at the mirror. She was holding out a wad of cash. 3 bills. A $100 bill and 2 20s. It was too much. Way more than necessary. "Oh, I appreciate it, but you already paid through the app," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "Here's your tip." Her voice was exactly the same as before. Flat, unemotional. I shook my head. "Really, it's fine. I can't take that." She didn't move her hand. "Here's your tip." This time, her voice was different, rough, like something was caught in her throat. I turned to look at her. The woman who had gotten into my car was gone. Her skin was almost white, stretched tight over her bones like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were completely blank, just empty, colorless voids staring right at me. Her clothes were filthy, torn in places, like she had clawed her way out of the ground. I lost control of the wheel. The car swerved, tires screeching against the pavement. I barely had time to register the telephone pole in front of me before everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. My whole body ached. A nurse was standing nearby, adjusting something on the monitor. "What happened?" My voice came out hoarse. "You were in a car accident," she said, offering a small, sympathetic smile. The memory hit me all at once. The ride. The woman. My chest tightened. "What about the passenger?" She frowned. "What passenger?" "The woman in my back seat," I said, struggling to sit up. "She was with me when I crashed." The nurse gave me a careful look, like she wasn't sure whether to humor me or call a doctor. "Sir, you were alone when they found you." That didn't make any sense. She was there. I saw her. "No," I said firmly. "She was right behind me." The nurse hesitated. Then, after a moment, she sighed. "You're not the first." A sick feeling settled in my stomach. "What do you mean?" She glanced toward the door as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then she lowered her voice. "There have been a lot of accidents on that stretch of road, all men, all late at night. The city tried fixing the bridge, putting up signs, everything, but the crashes kept happening." I swallowed hard. "And the other drivers?" She shook her head. "You're the first to survive." I couldn't breathe. "Why me?" I asked. She adjusted my IV, her expression unreadable. "Had you turned to take the money the first time she offered it, you wouldn't have." I stared at her, my mind racing. She continued, "The first crash like yours happened years ago. A couple got into a fight in their car. The husband was drunk and they were arguing over money. His wife had worked late that night, made some tips, and he wanted her to give it to him. She refused. He turned to yell at her, lost control of the wheel." I knew where this was going before she even said it. "She died in the crash," I murmured. The nurse nodded. "When they found her body, she had exactly $140 in her wallet." My head started spinning. "That's the same amount she offered me." She gave me a long look but didn't say anything, just told me to get some rest. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything. A few minutes later, as she was tidying up, she reached for the vase near the door. Then she froze. A second later, she let out a scream so loud it sent a jolt of panic through me. I sat up fast, ignoring the pain in my ribs. "What? What is it?" She had already backed away, eyes wide, hands shaking. The vase had fallen to the floor, shattering into pieces. I got out of bed, stepping carefully around the broken glass. My heart was pounding as I bent down to see what had scared her so badly. There was something under the vase. I picked it up. It was a small envelope. I turned it over, and my stomach dropped. Scrawled on the front in neat, precise handwriting were 3 words. "Here's your tip." Inside was exactly $140. This happened several years ago, probably around 2015 or 2016. At the time, I was working second shift as a mechanic at a trucking company about 30 miles from home. I became good friends with one of the guys on my shift, and we often hung out after work. Since we both lived in the same town, we'd usually stop at a gas station close to midnight to grab a case of beer before heading home. Behind my house, I had a fire pit set up in the woods, and most nights he'd follow me back so we could drink there without disturbing anyone. One night, after clocking out, we planned to hang out like usual, but this time, for some reason I don't remember, he couldn't follow me home. Instead, we agreed to meet at the church near my place. I picked up the beer and drove to the church parking lot to wait for him. After a while, he still hadn't shown up, so I got out of my car and stood by the hood watching the road for his headlights. Eventually, I saw his truck pull in. He parked next to me, and we both leaned against our vehicles, facing the headstones, talking while we drank. Then, out of nowhere, he interrupted me mid-sentence. "Do you see that?" I looked in the direction he was pointing. "See what?" He seemed unsettled. His expression was serious. This wasn't a joke. He told me he saw something moving near a headstone a few rows in. I squinted, but didn't see anything. He hesitated, then described what he had seen, a dark shadow, rocking back and forth. That sent a wave of unease through me. I asked if he had anything for protection, and he pulled back his jacket to show the 9mm holstered at his hip. Even armed, he had no intention of getting closer to that headstone. I, on the other hand, decided to check it out. Stepping off the pavement and onto the grass, I started walking toward the third row of headstones. The churchyard was well lit by several streetlights, so the only shadows came from the stones themselves. As I scanned the area, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. About 15 feet ahead, a pitch-black figure was sitting against a headstone, head resting between its knees, rocking steadily back and forth, exactly as my friend had described. What disturbed me even more was realizing that before my friend arrived, I had been standing there alone with this thing the entire time. I took a cautious step forward. "Are you okay?" No response. Just a faint whimper, like someone grieving. At first, I thought it might be someone visiting a grave, unusual at this hour, but not impossible. I moved closer, stopping about 3 feet away. That's when I noticed something was very, very wrong. Despite standing under direct light, the figure absorbed every bit of it. No details were visible. No clothing, no hair, no shoes, just pure solid darkness like a void in the shape of a person. The quiet whimpering turned into low, guttural moans. Keeping my nerves in check, I took slow steps backward before turning and rushing back to my friend. I didn't stop to explain. I just told him we needed to leave, immediately. We got in our vehicles and took off. About an hour later, curiosity got the better of us, and we returned. The cemetery was empty. My friend and I eventually lost touch, but I still tell this story because it's the only truly unexplainable experience I've ever had. To this day, I have no idea what we saw that night.